Welcome to Today at Wayne, a podcast that engages and informs the Wayne State University campus community. With news, announcements, information, and current events discussions relevant to the university's goals and mission, Today at Wayne serves as the perfect forum for our campus to begin a conversation or keep one going. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Today at Wayne podcast. I'm Daryl Dawsey. While America has always been a secular nation with our Constitution drawing a clear line of separation between state and church, it still goes without saying that religion has always played a huge role in the daily lives of both American people and the nation's politics. Whether it was the Puritans who arrived here from Europe or the Catholic Church and its extensive school system, conservative evangelicalism, or the politically charged Black Christianity that informed the left in the civil rights movement, religion and the houses of worship that extended them have always had a hand in shaping the nation's political direction. Now, research by two Wayne State University professors gives us an updated look into how churches shape not just the political views of their members, but the activism that springs from those views as well. Ronald E. Brown is an associate professor of political science at Wayne State University. He regularly teaches Introduction to American Government courses, Religion and Politics, and Detroit Politics to predominantly undergraduate students. His son, Dr. Khari Brown, is an associate professor of sociology at Wayne State University and the president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. Together, along with James S. Jackson, they have co-authored a new book, Race and the Power of Sermons on American Politics, that examines the impact that religion and religion institutions have on the lenses through which we view politics. Now here to talk about the book and their research are Dr. Khari Brown and Professor Ronald Brown. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, let's just kind of give our listeners a quick overview of what it is that you do. Can you give us some of the highlights of your research, of your recent research?
Sure. Dad, do you want to go or do you want to do this?
I go very first, and
go
then
ahead.
You can go.
Okay. Yeah.
The most important highlight is the fact that across racial groups, across members in the Latinx community, white Americans, Black Americans, if you're attending a church where you hear sermons, where you recall hearing sermons about politics, it's related to political engagement, particularly time-consuming political engagement, campaigning, going to meetings in communities. I think and that is consistent, going back from the 60s forward.
And I'll jump in and piggyback off of what Dad said. So we had in this book, we had 4 big questions that we wanted to answer. The one question is, what do Americans expect of their religious leaders and organizations? What do they hear? What type of sermons do they hear? And we're particularly concerned about sermons related to social justice and human rights.
Okay.
Sermons about race, sermons about poverty, sermons about immigration, sermons about war and peace. The next question we were interested in trying to answer is, what's the connection between what people hear from the religious leaders on those issues and what they think the appropriate role of the government is in addressing issues of race disparities, immigration reform, war and peace issues, and reducing poverty. And the final question that we were interested in looking at is, what impact does it have on what people actually do? So if you hear a sermon that talks about race disparities or criminal justice, does it have any impact at all on your willingness to vote, to engage in protest, to contact your elected officials, to participate in any campaign-related activities? Those were the 4 major questions that we were interested in answering. And because we understand the race has a huge impact on the experiences of Americans, we also wanted to know, how do these relationships vary by race?
Okay.
So those are the 4 big questions, and we can get into what we found and what it means in a bit.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I mean,
Sure.
we can limit it, I guess, to the highlights since we don't have a lot of time. But I am interested. What is it that you discovered in the course of your research?
Okay, go ahead, Dad.
Very quickly,
Sure.
to back up, why race? It's because of this idea of covenant. I mean, in terms of how large is the covenant, how small is the covenant, and so on. And by that, members that they share a common memory, a common narrative, and the role of providence. And so we are And so race has always divided the country. And that's why I think why race is central for us. And the fact that I grew up in a African-American church, a Pentecostal church. And for me, my first exposure to religion and politics, or church and politics, was going to Chicago in the summer of '69 or 1970, Operation Breadbasket, and hearing Jesse Jackson give a talk about, that linkage. And so I think the four questions that Khari is talking about, it's race and it's covenant, and we were answered, and that important dynamic.
Yeah, and I want to get to the findings really quickly, but I do think it's important to understand theologically, how the clergy are framing the issues that we really care about. What we discovered in our research, in our readings, and our personal experiences is that there are two major theological frames of the American experience in this country. On the one hand, you have this providential frame that we as Americans are blessed by providence. We have the strongest military, the strongest economy, the best universities, we're the wealthiest nation. How do you explain this? One theological frame is that it's through providence, that is God's blessing that we are in this position. Now, basically, we as Americans are the new Israelites. This is the North American continent, and even beyond that, the Western Hemisphere is the new Canaan, and God has granted it to us. So an indication of our wealth are our constitutions, our universities, our military, the opportunities for advancement in this country. And so looking at the American experience through this frame, you will come to the position that any form of inequality that exists in this country, or even beyond that, is not because of systemic racism or institutional racism. It's a reflection of your inability to take advantage of all the opportunities that God has made available for Americans. And any attempt from outside forces to weaken the U.S. is essentially an attempt to weaken God's blessing for us, the moral beacon of the world. That's one frame. The other frame, which we are particularly interested in, is this covenantal frame that Dad talked about. The idea that, yes, we have all these material gains in this country, but because we are in this position, we have a covenant with God to extend these opportunities to others. And the extent to which it is not extended to others is an indication that we are not moving close enough to God's will.
Okay.
The clergy that talk about race, poverty, military aggression, they're saying we're not there yet. We have to move in that direction. Even if government policies, the popular media says that we are in the right, does not mean that it is so. We have to continue moving in that direction. And so what we find, and just really quickly, African Americans, Hispanics, they're more likely to say, we want to hear these types of messages, largely because of their condition in this country. They're more likely to be in churches where they hear these types of messages. And the final thing that we find, and we can talk a bit about this, is that even though you see these race disparities in terms of what people want to hear and what people actually hear, when whites hear these messages, it tends to have a larger impact on their consciousness than it does for African Americans and Hispanics.
In what
and
way?
We think, go ahead. Yeah, sure. You want to jump in? Go ahead.
Yes. In what way they are more likely to support what we would call social welfare policies or anti-military policies. So the degree in which white Americans hear these sermons, they're more likely. Their policy positions line up with what one would expect to find among Black Americans and Hispanic Americans. I mean, that's the difference when they hear the messages. Now, we should make this point that it's a small number. It's not a huge number, but nonetheless, the number that do hear it, I mean, their policy positions line up with what you would find from African Americans and members of the Latinx community. What's important about that also is the fact that the influence of African American engagement over time. I mean, the fact that for us, what was intriguing is the fact that King, particularly King, Martin Luther King comes up over and over again in terms of either directly or indirectly in the sermons, that we explore and look at. And so that what's intriguing also is the fact that before, George Floyd, unfortunately, was murdered, there were sermons being preached in progressive, predominantly white churches about Black Lives Matter. So that I think that we do see this and this pattern consistently. Again, it's a small number, but it is consistent. In terms of seeing that, and so I think that for us is most intriguing. Now we're using, to say to those listening, we're using survey data. So we're exploring this phenomena among respondents and surveys that go back as far as 1960, 61, in terms of Matthews and Pearlfield study about civil rights, all the way to the works that Khari and I and the late James Jackson were working on in terms of the national politics study. And so we find this kind of, if whites hear it, they're lining up with how Black Americans would feel about about a progressive covenant, a covenant in which everyone is included.
Right. Now, even if those folks, let's somebody once said the most segregated day in America is on Sunday, when you have folks going to their respective churches based along racial lines. To what degree do you talk about how these religious views impact, or these religious principles impact views on race and other political matters, but to what degree do you think race impacts the religious views themselves? To what degree are the religious views designed or shaped around already pre-existing notions about race? And is that a problem?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think the experiences that people bring into the places of worship, they're going to impact what people are willing to consider once they're in the place of worship, and it's also going to impact what the clergy is willing to preach about. Because, as you mentioned, First Amendment of the Constitution allows for freedom of religion, which means you don't have to go, period. And the clergy is dependent upon the congregant to attend. Even in those denominations where you have a bishop appointing someone to a place of worship, if people don't show up, you don't have a congregation. Okay. So it's the racial experiences, and when I say when we talk about racial experiences, it's yes, your individual experience. It's also your collective experience as well, from what you've been led to believe, from what you've learned in school, family members, what you see in the media. That has a huge impact on how people frame their racial group interests and what they're willing to consider about what government policies they're willing to consider. So if a clergy member gets up in a predominantly white, theologically, politically conservative, Republican-dominated place of worship, that individual has to tread lightly, because he or she may lose the congregation if they go too far beyond what their congregants are willing to accept. So definitely it does. And I think that in terms of our findings, that has a large impact on what we find. On the one hand, African Americans and Hispanics, like we said, are more willing to say, yes, please talk about injustices in varying forms, because they're on the bottom. So, but if you're whites overall, but particularly among Republicans, are less likely to say we are willing to hear these messages, because again, they have a different framework in terms of where we are in this country. We are in this country because
it justifies your current social position.
And if it doesn't, the pastor often is saying you need to sacrifice, whether psychologically, economically, you need to sacrifice. That's hard for people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, I mean, this is a nation that has, at least outwardly, presented itself as a secular nation. We have a very strong demarcation in the superseding document of this country, the Constitution, between church and state. But obviously, that line gets crossed all the time. What is, just based on your findings, have you sort of come to any conclusions about what we are as a country in terms of our identity and, what it is we claim to be versus what it is that we really are? I mean, are there any sort of general takeaways that you guys were able to develop based on?
Well, I think one takeaway is the fact that sin, and the idea of sin in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is predominant in the American political narrative. And I think that is a theme, that one sees. And so while there is separation of church and state, that separation gets blurred. And one of the things that Khari and I write about in this book is the fact that clergy are also competing with a civic religious tradition of American presidents who are very charismatic. Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama, Lincoln's narratives all take this idea of sin, of being fragile, providence, and so you're competing with a very powerful entity, an American president who has power in terms of determining the well-being of the economy and the nation. So I think clergy also find themselves, in that particular challenge. And I'll let Khari talk about in terms of what we find in terms of Reverend Regas. Khari, could you?
Oh,
We find it.
yeah.
About, yeah.
That's a good segue. So, it relates to what you stated, Daryl, as well in terms of where we are as a nation. Well, the separation between church and state. I think one thing to remember with this is that with that clause, it was intended to ensure that the government couldn't force people to accept a state religion that essentially would say that God has mandated that I am president, or God has mandated that the policies that we have, you cannot oppose these policies because God has mandated them. If you allow people to select the congregations, they may select congregations that take no position at all on anything, which most congregations don't. Most congregations do not they don't preach political sermons.
Okay.
And it is important to mention that in our, as Dad stated, you get about 30% of the time consistently that clergy are talking about political issues. And this is at least one time a year. And I think most are probably saying this like a few times a year. And it's a very few that are actually in the streets, practicing what they're preaching. There's maybe 2 or 3% that are actually the super activists. That's what you find. So it's rare, but it's a committed group that are engaged in those type of activities. And for them, religion is a frame for how they understand their experiences. It's a frame for how am I supposed to relate to my neighbor in my neighborhood, in my city, in my nation, all over the world. That's the frame. But yeah, as Dad said, the challenge is that we're constantly being reminded that no, your neighbors are really restricted to certain groups.
Okay.
Either your race group or your nation group, and that is it. And you have clergy that are talking about race, poverty, immigration, world peace. They're saying no, that's not it. Your neighbor is all of humankind. That is your neighbor. That's the challenge in terms of what should the government do to ensure that we can relate to one another as Americans and as humans.
Okay. Now it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like a lot of your work looked at the Christian church. Metro Detroit has a large, Muslim community, Muslim population. Mosques, masjids, they play a huge role in the daily lives of folks here. Synagogues play a huge role. Does your research in any way look at how the institutions representative of these other major religions impact the political views and activism of their members? And if so, can you tell me a little bit about how?
Well, I'm saying no, because going back, we're looking at survey research,
okay,
which are national representative samples.
Okay.
And so, that we do have respondents that identify as Jewish, or they may identify either as Sunni or Shia Muslims, but they're so small that we cannot do any type of analysis and draw an inference in terms of what we find. And so that, yes, we're limited to our data is limited to that. But let me say this, that we are proposing to do a Detroit metropolitan survey.
Okay.
And we're hoping, to actually pick up, maybe a wider breadth of individuals. But no, we are limited to national findings. But let me say this, however, I'm gonna draw an inference of what I said earlier, and that is to say that the degree to which these other groups, particularly if you look at post 9/11, where Detroit, New York City, the degree to which a imam is too active, too vocal, what they're going to find is police surveillance.
Okay.
Police surveillance in terms of the mosque. And also, I think that indeed, I'm thinking back to when President Bush gave his speeches, that what he did, largely was to frame, this is not against Islam, but the way he framed it, it was the othering that took place. And so I would say that you run the risk, if you are a member of a smaller minority group in the country politically, of state intervention and state surveillance. In the same way one finds, burning of Black churches, the assassination of Malcolm X, King, and others, that imams have to be extremely careful because of the possibility of police surveillance. So I think that is, a theme that we can draw, an inference that we can draw, based upon, the research that we've doing in terms of our national surveys.
Okay, all right. We're getting close to ending, so we're going to try to wrap things up. But I do want to ask one other question. I saw a Pew survey recently that suggested that the largest growing "quote unquote" religious group in the country are actually non-religious people, those who either don't have an affiliation or those who don't share a particular belief or have, at best, perhaps a sort of vaguely defined belief system that may not fall under the heading of Christianity or Judaism or Islam or anything like that. As these numbers grow, well, first of all, are you seeing the impact of this growth on the influence of the church and its ability to kind of shape these views? And what does this sort of mean? What does this portend for the future impact of the church in the ways that we've been talking about?
It's definitely a challenge. And you are seeing declines among many different demographics, the racial groups. But the biggest challenge is that it's, the growth of the religious non-population is growing faster among the youngest Americans.
Okay.
So it does have implications for the future of the relevance of religion on how we see the world, how we relate to one another. But I think there's opportunities, though, for particularly among the progressive, which we were particularly interested in, the progressive religious groups, of regardless of religious faith or denomination, because the messages and the causes that, for example, the clergy that took public position on Black Lives Matter protests during the period from May 25th, 2020 to now, in terms of opening their churches for BLM activists, having prayer vigils, having public worship services where they're declaring support for anti-racism and working with groups to try to change local and national policies. Their positions on not just, criminal justice reform, but also minimum wage movement, environmental movement, is very consistent with political ideologies and the philosophical worldviews of the group in which are abandoning religious circles.
Okay.
I think it's a market, excuse me. To use a business analogy, I think it's a marketing issue, making it very clear in terms of how they position their religious faith with their views about how we should relate to one another, how our government should relate to us as citizens. That's a tough task, however, because the frame that many people have of religion is that it's very conservative, that it's very I don't like to use the word, but anti-woke. But when you look at what's happening on the ground, there's quite a few examples of clergy that are very outspoken, walking with the people on the issues that they care about. So I think that it is a challenge, but I think it's something that, through careful thought and study, that they can work around. And the last point I'll make on this is that the issue is not a belief in a higher power or belief in faith or belief in the possibility of a better tomorrow. The issue is institutional. It's how they perceive the organization of religion, not the potential of what religion can do for how we relate to one another. That's what I think progressive churches need to get a handle around and try to capture this and to share this message with potential converts.
Yes, go ahead. To kind of build on the legacy, get out there, struggle with the people around the issues that matter to the people. To that degree, will they continue to have relevance or gain greater relevance?
Make them aware of what they're doing, because a lot of them are already doing it. Just make them aware of what they're already doing. Yeah, I'll stay there. You can go ahead, Dad.
Daryl, what I want to do is circle back to your question about the Detroit metro area. The interfaith, one way for us to explore this is the interfaith councils in the area. And so that their website is available enough. And listening to the president of that group, what you hear the same messages that we find in our research. It's about, as Khari just stated, it's about collective idea of solidarity with one's neighbor. And so the Interfaith Council of Peace has a variety of religious groups in the Detroit metro area. Again, it's small. I'll say the same thing. It's a very small group, but their message is very similar to what we find in our research. And so I want to say that, and say that also the decline of youth. The pandemic may change all of this. I mean, what's interesting is that the pandemic may change all of this.
Okay.
Because our idea, I mean, we're losing faith in science.
That's true.
I mean, we're losing faith in science, trust in principles,
Mhm.
trust in clergy.
Right.
So this may force all of us as a society to rethink about, as we said earlier, what is the covenant?
Right.
I mean, what is the covenant? Who's in? Who's out?
Mhm.
And so the clergy, both inside institutions and outside of it, I mean, their challenge is to have us reimagine and rethink what it means to be guided by providence. I think this idea of being guided by providence, whether one is inside or outside of an institution, is in America.
Gotcha.
Because most Americans still believe in heaven and hell. I mean, whether you're inside or outside,
Okay.
the idea of the afterlife
Mhm.
in a secular society is predominant in our society. And again, I think this pandemic, we don't know yet. We have to see what it looks like in the future. It could change everything because of the impact it's had on all of us.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I don't want to hold you guys up too much
Sure.
longer. That's about it in terms of my
Yep.
line of questioning, but I do want to give you an opportunity to kind of close things out, give you the last word if I can. Is there anything perhaps that we may not have touched on that you want to address, or something you want to clarify or amplify on before we get out of here?
I'll let Khari do that.
Sure. I mean, this was a very insightful conversation. I really appreciate you having us on. I mean, I think what I want to end with is just the potential for the future and hope for the future. I think the congregations that are most active, and the one congregation I keep mentioning as an example, is Central United Methodist Church, which is located downtown Detroit. They have a history of human rights activism going from 1963 with the March on Woodward. King spoke at Central before leading the march down Woodward in 1963. That even though it seems as if materially things are changing very slowly, these congregations that are on the front line, they have hope and faith that there will be a better day. And that gives me hope when I look at these institutions, and hope is just a human being, that things will get better. I'll stop there, and I want to thank you again for having us on.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you both taking
Thank you,
the time.
Gerald. Yeah, thank you.
You guys are doing fantastic research. I'm looking forward to reading, more of your findings and to see
Sure.
more of what you've learned and what you've got to teach us. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
All
Thank
right.
you.
This has been great. I'm Daryl Dawsey. This is the Today at Wayne podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for listening to Today at Wayne. We'd love to hear from you, our campus community, about other podcast ideas and topics. What compelling things are you doing to spread the good word about living, learning, working, and playing like a warrior? Let us know by visiting todayatwayne.edu.